The final jolt of the stagecoach sent a wave of sickness through Evelyn's heart. She pressed a hand against her abdomen, a futile gesture against the churning inside, and focused on a crack in the dry leather of the seat opposite. For 3 days, that crack had been her anchor, a tiny, unchanging line in a world of dust and violent motion. Outside, the Wyoming Territory was a canvas of brown and pale green under a vast, bleached sky. The sun hammered the roof of the coach, turning the small space into an oven. Her fellow passenger, an elderly minister with kind, watery eyes, shifted on his seat. He had tried to make conversation hours ago, but Evelyn's short, polite answers had eventually convinced him to retreat into his Bible. Now, as the coach slowed, its wheels grinding in the thick dust, he leaned forward. He asked her, "Are you all right? My child, you look pale." Evelyn managed a small smile. "The journey has been long, is all. I will be fine once my feet are on solid ground." The minister nodded, his gaze compassionate. He looked out the window. "Bitter willow," he said, "not much to look at, but folks here have a strength to them, forged by the land." "I suppose." He paused, then asked, "Are you meeting family?" A lie felt heavy on her tongue, but the truth was a stone too heavy to carry into a new life. "My betrothed," she answered, the word foreign and brittle. He smiled. "A new beginning. May the Lord bless your union and your home." The coach lurched to a final stop. The driver shouted something unintelligible. The minister gathered his satchel and offered Evelyn a hand, which she took gratefully. Stepping down onto the dusty main street of Bitter Willow was like stepping into a furnace. The air was thick with the scent of sagebrush, horse sweat, and something else, something sharp and lonely. The wind, a constant, tireless force, pushed at her skirts and whipped strands of brown hair from her tightly pinned bun. It carried the grit that stung her cheeks. The minister tipped his hat. "God be with you, miss." He pointed a crooked finger down the street. "The parsonage is that way, should you ever need it." He turned and walked away, a small black figure against the immense, sun-blasted landscape. Alone, Evelyn clutched her worn leather valise. Inside, her few belongings were a testament to a life she had packed up in haste: a second dress, her sewing kit, and a small, faded photograph of a woman with her own eyes and a sad smile. Her mother, she whispered to the uncaring wind, a prayer meant only for herself and the tiny, secret life she carried. "I just want peace for the child." Bitter Willow was a single street carved from the wilderness. It had a saloon with swinging doors, a blacksmith's forge that rang with the rhythmic clang of a hammer, a livery, and a general store with a broad wooden porch. A few horses were tied to a hitching rail, their tails flicking at flies in a slow, defeated rhythm. Mountains, the color of a deep bruise, watched from the horizon. The creek bed she had crossed on the way into town was nothing but a ribbon of cracked, pale mud. A woman swept the porch of the general store, her movements brisk and efficient. She paused, leaning on her broom, her eyes narrowing as Evelyn approached. The stagecoach was an event, and a lone woman passenger was a spectacle. As Evelyn drew closer, the woman called into the store's dim interior. "Martha, come look. I think this is her, the one for the Mallory place." Another woman, stout and aproned, appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands. Her face was a mixture of curiosity and judgment. "She's younger than I pictured," she said, not bothering to lower her voice, "and looks frail. This country eats frail things for breakfast." Evelyn kept her chin high and her gaze forward, the women's words prickling her skin like burrs. She had faced worse than gossip. She had survived a winter of cold words and colder silences in her own home. She could survive this. Her destination was the stagecoach office at the end of the street, where she was told Mr. Thaddeus Mallory would meet her. Near the small wooden building, a man was bent over the wheel of a farmer's wagon. One of the spokes had splintered. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity, his broad shoulders straining against the fabric of his dusty blue shirt. A nervous bay horse hitched to the wagon stamped its feet, its eyes wide with fright at the noise of the nearby blacksmith. The man working on the wheel did not look up, but he spoke to the horse. His voice was low and calm, a deep rumble that seemed to soothe the agitated air. "Easy now, boy, just a bit of noise. Nothing that can hurt you." The horse's ears twitched, and it settled, blowing a soft breath through its nostrils. Evelyn stopped, drawn by the simple act of kindness. The man straightened up, wiping a smear of grease from his hands onto a rag. He was tall, taller than she had expected, with sun-weathered skin and a jaw that looked as stubborn as the mountains. A faint, silvery scar cut across his cheekbone. When he finally turned, his eyes met hers. They were gray, the color of a sky just before a storm, and held a surprising stillness. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Ma'am." "Are you Mr. Mallory?" she asked, her voice a little unsteady. He seemed to consider the question for a moment. "I am a Mallory," he said. "My name is Weston. Folks call me Wes. You must be Miss Hart." "Yes, Evelyn Hart." She clutched her valise a little tighter. "Your brother, Mr. Thaddeus Mallory. He was to meet me." "Thad is at the ranch," Wes said, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before shifting to the horizon. "Business? He sent me instead." He turned back to the wheel. "Let me finish with this, and I will take you out to the Broken Star." The farmer who owned the wagon, a man with a face like a dried apple, scurried over. "You do not have to do that. Wes, I can manage." Wes simply shook his head and slotted a new piece of wood into place. "A man's wheel breaks. You help him fix it." He worked without another word, his movements economical and sure. Evelyn watched his hands, strong and capable, and felt a tiny, unfamiliar flicker of ease. He was not what she had pictured. The letters from Thaddeus had been proper, formal, and devoid of any warmth. They spoke of duty, of building a respectable home, of a wife's role. They had felt like a contract. This man, his quiet brother, felt like something else entirely. Solid, real. When the wheel was fixed, Wes spoke briefly with the grateful farmer, refusing any payment. He then untied a sturdy-looking buckskin from the rail and led it over to a wagon that bore a brand of a star with a crack through it. The Broken Star. He loaded her valise into the back and then turned to help her up to the seat. His hand was rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as it brushed hers. The ride out to the ranch was mostly silent. The wagon wheels crunched over the dry earth, and the sun beat down relentlessly. Wes seemed comfortable in the quiet, his attention on the trail ahead. After a long while, he glanced at her. "The wind out here talks more than most folks," he said, his voice a low drawl. "You getting used to it?" The unexpected question startled her. She looked at the way the wind bent the tall grasses and sculpted the clouds against the deep blue. "Every patch has a seam," she replied, the words coming to her from years spent over a needle and thread. "I reckon the wind here sews the clouds to the mountains." A slow smile touched the corners of his mouth, softening the stern lines of his face. "That is a fine way to put it. I have never heard it said like that before." The silence that followed felt different, less empty, more companionable. The Broken Star Ranch sat in a wide, shallow valley, sheltered by a low rise of hills. The main house was a long, sturdy structure made of timber and stone, with a wide porch. A few barns and corrals stood nearby. It was a place of substance, built to withstand the harshness of the land. But as they drew closer, Evelyn saw the signs of the drought. The grass in the pastures was yellowed, and the cattle looked thin. The air of prosperity she had imagined was muted by a sense of struggle. A man stood on the porch, watching their approach. He was built like his brother, tall and broad, but he held himself with a rigid stiffness. His face was clean-shaven, and his clothes were cleaner than his brother's. This had to be Thaddeus Mallory. As Wes pulled the wagon to a stop, Thaddeus came down the steps. his boots making a hard, deliberate sound on the packed earth. His eyes, a colder gray than his brother's, swept over Evelyn from head to toe. It was not a look of welcome. It was an inspection. "You are Evelyn Hart," he stated. It was not a question. "Yes, Mr. Mallory, it is a pleasure to meet you." He gave a curt nod. The journey was acceptable. "It was," she said, ignoring the lie. Wes hopped down from the wagon. "I will see to the horses. Thad," he gave Evelyn a brief, unreadable glance before leading the team away, leaving her alone with her intended. Thaddeus Mallory did not invite her inside. He stood on the bottom step, forcing her to look up at him. "My letters describe the terms of our arrangement clearly," he said. "This is a partnership. I provide a home and security. You provide respectability, diligence, and, in time, an heir. The Mallory name is important in this territory. I expect it to be honored." "I understand," Evelyn said, her hands growing cold despite the heat. "Good. Your duties will begin tomorrow. For now, you can get settled. Wes will show you to your room." He turned as if to go back inside, but a carriage was pulling up the long drive, kicking up a plume of red dust. A well-dressed man and woman sat inside. Thaddeus sighed, a sound of pure irritation. The Pratts, the banker and his wife, Constance Pratt, were the arbiters of Bitter Willow society. Vernon Pratt was a portly man with a self-important air. His wife was thin and sharp-featured, her eyes missing nothing. She smiled a bright, predatory smile as she alighted from the carriage. "Thaddeus," she chirped, ignoring Evelyn completely. "We were just passing by and thought we would see if your package had arrived." "Constance," Thaddeus said, his voice tight. "This is Miss Evelyn Hart. Miss Hart, this is Mrs. Pratt and her husband, Vernon." Constance's eyes raked over Evelyn, cataloging her simple, travel-worn dress and the weariness in her face. "A pleasure," she said, though her tone suggested the opposite. "From Missouri, I hear. A long way to come for a husband. One must wonder what a woman is leaving behind to travel so far." Just then, a wave of nausea, sharp and sudden, rose in Evelyn's throat. It was the heat, the journey, the tension. Without thinking, her body acting on an instinct far older and more powerful than propriety. She pressed her left hand flat against her lower belly, trying to will the sickness away. It was a small gesture, a secret one. But Constance Pratt's sharp eyes saw it. They flickered down to Evelyn's hand, then back up to her face. A slow, knowing smirk spread across her lips. "Well now," she said, her voice dripping with sweet poison. "It seems you may have brought more with you from Missouri than just a suitcase, Miss Hart. A little something to add to the Mallory legacy right from the start." The words hung in the hot, still air. Thaddeus Mallory's face went rigid, his eyes turning from cold gray to chips of ice. He looked from Constance's triumphant sneer to the place where Evelyn's hand rested on her abdomen, and in that single, terrible moment, Evelyn Hart knew her new beginning had just ended. The fragile peace she had prayed for had shattered before she had even set her foot inside the house. The dust of Bitter Willow settled around her, feeling as heavy as a shroud. The world seemed to shrink to the space on the porch, the air sucked out of it by Constance Pratt's vicious words. For a long, silent moment, no one moved. The only sound was the incessant wind whispering through the dry grass, a sound that suddenly felt like a judgment. Vernon Pratt shifted his weight, looking from his wife to Thaddeus Mallory with an expression of smug anticipation. Thaddeus's face was a mask of cold fury. The humiliation was a visible thing, a dark stain spreading across his features. He took a step down, his eyes locked on Evelyn, and she saw in them the death of all her hopes. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, tied bundle of letters. Her letters. He held them out as if they were something foul. He said, his voice low and dangerous, "The Mallorys do not take on other men's debts. Our agreement was based on truth, on honor. You have brought neither to this house?" He did not hand her the letters. He opened his fingers and let them fall into the red dust at her feet. They landed with a soft, final thud. Tears pricked Evelyn's eyes, hot and sharp. But she would not let them fall. Not here, not in front of these people. She looked at the scattered papers, the carefully chosen words she had written by lamplight in Missouri, full of a desperate, edited hope. She raised her gaze to meet his. "I am sorry," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I am sorry I was not brave enough to write the whole truth. I was afraid." "Afraid?" he scoffed. "Your fear is not my concern. My name, however, is—" He raised his voice. "A clear proclamation for the benefit of the Pratts. The arrangement is void." From the direction of the barn, another figure emerged. Wes moved with a long, unhurried stride, his storm-gray eyes taking in the scene in a single, sweeping glance, the Pratts in their fine carriage, smug as two cats in a creamery, his brother, rigid with pride and anger on the steps, and Evelyn, standing alone in the dust, her life scattered at her feet along with her letters. He had heard enough. He walked past the carriage without a word to its occupants. He walked past his brother, ignoring Thaddeus's sharp, warning glare. He stopped directly in front of Evelyn. His shadow fell over her, a sudden, welcome relief from the punishing sun. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, his gaze touching briefly on the hand she still had pressed to her abdomen. Then, meeting her eyes, he saw the terror there, but he also saw a flicker of defiance, the same grit she had shown on the ride from town. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and took her hand. His grip was firm, grounding. He did not look at his brother. He did not look at anyone but her. And, in the ringing silence, he spoke two words, his voice a low, steady anchor in the swirling storm of her ruin. "I will stay." The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a gunshot. Constance Pratt's jaw fell slack. Thaddeus's face contorted with disbelief. Then rage. "What did you say?" Thaddeus hissed, taking a step toward his brother. Wes did not release Evelyn's hand. He turned his head slightly to face his brother. "I said I will stay. I am staying with her." It was an act of rebellion so profound, so contrary to the rigid order of Thaddeus's world, that for a moment he was speechless. Then the fury erupted. "Are you insane?" Thaddeus roared, his voice cracking. "Have you lost your mind? This woman is a stranger, a liar who has come here under false pretenses, carrying another man's shame. You would stand with that. You would smear our family name with that filth. The child won't bear the Mallory name." He spat, his eyes flicking with disgust toward Evelyn's belly. Wes's grip tightened on her hand. "Whose blood it has does not decide who it will become," he said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "The adults do that." Evelyn found her voice, pulling her hand from his grasp, the sudden warmth of his touch leaving her skin cold. "I do not need your pity," she said, looking at Wes, her pride a raw, wounded thing. "I will not be a burden passed from one brother to another." Wes looked back at her, and the stillness in his eyes was not pity. It was something else, something deeper and more resolute. "I am not pitying you," he said softly, so only she could hear. "I am choosing to stand." "This is madness!" Thaddeus shouted, his authority crumbling before his very eyes. "This is a disgrace!" Constance Pratt, recovering from her shock, nudged her husband. "Come, Vernon," she said, her voice practically vibrating with the thrill of the scandal she was about to unleash upon Bitter Willow. "This is a family matter. We should not intrude." She gave Thaddeus a look of faux sympathy that was more insulting than any sneer. He barely noticed. His entire being was focused on the mutiny of his own brother. The Pratt's carriage rattled away, leaving a cloud of dust and a thick, choking silence in its wake. Thaddeus pointed a trembling finger at Evelyn. "I want you off my land, off Broken Star Land, before the sun sets." "And you," he said, turning on Wes, If you choose to stand with her, you can go with her. This house, this ranch, was built on reputation, on strength, not on charity for strays. The threat hung between them, heavy and absolute. The ranch was Wes's life as much as it was Thaddeus's. They had built it together from their father's legacy. To be cast out was to be cast into nothing. Evelyn felt a fresh wave of despair. She had not only ruined her own chances, she had brought ruin upon the one person who had shown her a moment of kindness. "I will go," she said quickly. "Mr. Mallory, I will leave. Your brother has no part in this." "It is too late for that," Thaddeus said, his voice cold as a winter river. "The choice has been made." Wes looked from his brother's unforgiving face to Evelyn's pale, determined one. He saw the harsh reality of the situation laid bare. A lone woman, pregnant and with no money, turned out into the wilderness as evening approached. Her fate would be grim. He had seen what this land did to the unprepared and the unprotected. He thought of another woman, years ago, of a fever that had moved too fast, of his own hesitation, his own feeling of being one step too late. He would not be too late again. He spoke, not to his brother, but to Evelyn. His logic was as stark and practical as the landscape around them. "Miss Hart, you cannot go anywhere. Not like this. Constance Pratt will have your story all over town by now. No respectable door will open for you. No one will give you work." Her chin trembled, but she held it high. "I am a seamstress. I can work." He shook his head, a gesture of sad finality. "Not fast enough. Winter is coming. You and the child?" He did not need to finish the sentence. "What is your point, Weston?" Thaddeus demanded. "My point, Thad, is that there is only one way to protect her now. To give the child a name and a roof. To quiet the tongues that are already wagging." A horrifying understanding dawned on Thaddeus's face. "No, absolutely not." Wes turned fully to Evelyn, his gray eyes holding hers, asking her to see the hard sense in his words. "Miss Hart, Evelyn, I am asking you to marry me, in name only, a partnership, just like the one you agreed to. I will give you my name, and the protection that comes with it. The child will have that name too. We can take the old cabin by the woods. It is still on Mallory land, but it will be ours. It is the only way." The proposal was the most unromantic, desperate, and noble thing she had ever heard. It was not a declaration of love, but an act of profound decency. It was a shield offered against a cruel world. Her mind reeled. To escape one unwanted arrangement only to be thrust into another. But this was different. This was not a contract for an heir and a housekeeper. This was a man choosing to stand in the path of a storm for her. She looked at Thaddeus's face, full of rage and wounded pride. She looked at the vast, indifferent land stretching out in every direction, and she looked at Wes, at the quiet strength in his face, the scar on his cheek, the absolute resolve in his storm-gray eyes. He was offering her a chance. Not for peace, not yet, but for survival. She took a deep breath, the sage-scented air filling her lungs, and she nodded. Their wedding was not an occasion of joy, but a stark and necessary act, performed under a sky the color of dust. The small wooden church in Bitter Willow was mostly empty. The minister, whose kind eyes had offered Evelyn a moment of peace upon her arrival, stood before them, his voice a low and solemn murmur against the sound of the wind rattling the window panes. Their only witnesses were two of the Broken Star's oldest ranch hands, men whose loyalty to Wes was etched into their sun-creased faces. They stood awkwardly near the back, hats held in their gnarled hands, their presence a silent testament of support that was worth more than a church full of well-wishers. Thaddeus was not there. He had made it clear that while he could not stop his brother's folly, he would not sanction it with his presence. As Evelyn stood beside Wes, she was intensely aware of the space between them, a chasm of circumstance and necessity. He wore a clean shirt, and his jaw was freshly shaven. He looked solid, dependable. a rock in the turbulent river her life had become, when he slipped a simple, unadorned gold band onto her finger, a ring he had purchased from the general store an hour before. His touch was brief and businesslike, yet it sent a tremor through her. It felt real, binding. Outside the church, the whispers of the town were a tangible force. The few people on the street stopped to stare, their faces a mixture of avid curiosity and stern disapproval. Constance Pratt's poison had worked quickly. They were a spectacle, a scandal given flesh and bone. Wes seemed not to notice, or perhaps he had chosen not to. He helped Evelyn onto the wagon seat with the same quiet courtesy as before, and they rode out of Bitter Willow without looking back. Their new home was a small cabin set near a grove of cottonwoods at the far edge of the Broken Star property. It had been used by trappers years ago and had stood empty for a decade. Wes had spent the previous day making it habitable, but it was a rough place. There was one main room with a large stone fireplace, a small sleeping loft, and a lean-to kitchen. The air was thick with the smell of old smoke and disuse. That first evening, the reality of her situation settled upon her. She was a wife to a stranger, living in a borrowed cabin, carrying another man's child. Wes built a fire in the hearth, but a flaw in the chimney sent puffs of acrid smoke into the room, making their eyes water. He worked on it patiently, adjusting the flue, his silhouette dark against the flickering flames. They ate a silent meal of biscuits and dried beef he had brought from the main house. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of survival. The drought held the land in a tight, merciless grip. The well near the cabin was low, each bucket of murky water drawn up with effort. The cattle Wes had claimed as his portion of the ranch's herd were thin, their ribs showing. He spent his days from sunup to sundown riding the fence lines, searching for any patch of decent grazing he might have missed, and working to deepen the well. Evelyn, a woman whose life had been spent with needle and thread in the close confines of a Missouri town, found herself in a world of bewildering, endless tasks. She learned that baking bread at this altitude, with a temperamental wood stove, was a science she had yet to master. Her first few loaves were dense, heavy things. One afternoon, Wes came in from the heat, exhausted and covered in dust, and found her staring at a particularly disastrous loaf on the cutting board. Tears of frustration welled in her eyes. "It is hard enough to build a new barn," she said, her voice thick. Wes picked it up, testing its weight. He broke off a piece and chewed it thoughtfully. Then he nodded. "Well," he said, his mouth twitching with a smile he was trying to suppress, "we will save money on bricks. But you keep practicing. I prefer a roof that is soft." A startled laugh escaped her, the first genuine laugh she had uttered in months. The tension in the small cabin eased, chased away by a shared moment of gentle humor. It was a start. She learned to tend the small garden he had tilled for her, coaxing stubborn vegetables from the dry soil. She found a strange satisfaction in mending a tear in a calf's hide. Her small, neat stitches a mark of her own particular skill in this wild place. She began to ride, tentatively at first, on an old, placid mare Wes had chosen for her. From horseback, the world seemed even bigger, the mountains more imposing, the sky a vast and lonely ocean. In a small corral near the cabin, Wes kept a horse that was the color of midnight. His name was Ash. He was a magnificent animal, powerful and intelligent, but something in his past had broken his trust in men. He would shy from any sudden movement, his eyes rolling white with fear. The ranch hands at the main house had given up on him, calling him dangerous, but Wes saw something else. Every evening, after his work was done, he would go to the corral. He never carried a rope or a bridle. He would simply stand inside the fence, talking to the horse in that same low, calm voice Evelyn had first heard in town. He would stand for an hour or more, sometimes making no move at all, just letting Ash get used to his presence. Slowly, inch by inch, day by day, he closed the distance. Evelyn would watch from the cabin window. She saw in his infinite patience with the animal a reflection of his patience with her. He never pushed her, never asked about her past, never demanded anything more than the quiet partnership he had offered. He was taming the horse's fear, and without knowing it, he was taming hers as well. But the past did not stay buried. It came to her in the dark, in dreams that left her heart pounding and her skin slick with a cold sweat. She would see her late husband's face, not as it was at the end, pale and thin from the pneumonia that had claimed him, but as it had been in anger. She would hear his voice, not the wheezing whisper it had become, but the sharp, cutting tone he used when she displeased him. He had not been a man of physical violence, but his words had been blows, leaving bruises on her spirit that no one could see. He had made her feel small, worthless, a prisoner in her own home. The child she carried was not born of love, but of a desperate, lonely duty. One night, a particularly vivid dream left her gasping for air. She sat bolt upright in her small cot in the loft. A sob caught in her throat. Below, she heard a floorboard creak. "Evelyn," Wes's voice came from the darkness. "Are you all right?" She could not answer, her throat tight with unshed tears. She heard him move to the fireplace and stir the embers, bringing a soft, flickering glow to the room. He did not climb the ladder to the loft. He just stood by the fire, a silent, steady presence in the shadows. His respect for her privacy was so complete that it made her want to weep. After a long time, her breathing evened out. The dream's sharp edges began to soften. "Just a bad dream," she finally whispered down into the quiet. He nodded, though she could barely see him. "The wind is telling stories tonight. Sometimes they are not happy ones." He stayed by the fire until he was sure she had settled back to sleep, a silent guardian against the ghosts of her past. Their isolation was broken by necessary trips to Bitter Willow for supplies. On their first trip as a married couple, the weight of the town's judgment was a physical thing. People stopped talking when they entered the general store. Women who had nodded politely to Wes for years now offered him a curt, cold glance before turning their backs on Evelyn. Constance Pratt was there, of course, holding court near the fabric bolts. She greeted them with a smile that was all teeth. "Why, Mrs. Mallory," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "How good to see you out and about. Marriage agrees with you. You have a certain glow." Evelyn's face burned, but Wes simply met Constance's malicious gaze with his own steady one. "It is a dry season, Mrs. Pratt. I am sure everyone is hoping for a change in the weather." He guided Evelyn toward the counter, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a simple, protective gesture that spoke louder than any angry retort. They gathered their flour and coffee and salt, paid the tight-lipped store owner, and left. The silence that followed their exit was as loud as a slamming door. As they were loading the wagon, they saw Thaddeus across the street, talking to Vernon Pratt outside the bank. The banker was speaking in a low, insistent tone, his fleshy face serious. Thaddeus stood rigidly, listening, his jaw tight. When he saw them, his expression hardened. He gave them a curt, dismissive nod and turned his back. Stepping into the bank with Pratt, the rift between the brothers was a chasm, wide and deep. The ride back to the cabin was quiet. The weight of the town's scorn and his brother's rejection seemed to settle on Wes's shoulders. Evelyn felt a surge of guilt, a familiar, bitter taste. She was the source of all this trouble. She was the storm that had broken over his life. "I am sorry," she said softly. He looked over at her, his gray eyes questioning. "For what?" "For all of this," she said, gesturing vaguely at the hostile world they had just left behind. "For the trouble with your brother. For the whispers." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze on the dusty road ahead. "People will talk," he said finally. "That is what they do. It is like the wind. You cannot stop it. You just have to build your house strong enough to stand against it. As for my brother, Thad has his own storm to weather. It has got nothing to do with you." He did not explain further. He did not need to. In that moment, she understood. He had not offered her pity. He had offered her partnership, and he was holding to his end of the bargain, standing firm against the wind, just as he had promised. The heat of late summer bled into the punishing glare of early autumn, and still no rain came. The land grew brittle, the grasses bleached to the color of bone, the lifeblood of the valley. A man-made channel called Willow Ditch had dwindled from a healthy stream to a trickle, and now to a long, gaping wound of cracked mud and thirsty stones. Wes stood on its bank, his boots deep in the fine, gray dust that should have been a riverbed. He looked downstream, where the ditch fed the pastures of the Broken Star, and then upstream, where its source lay. The water that should have been theirs now pooled uselessly on the far side of a property line, on land belonging to a man named Luther Kane. Kane was a shadow that had long hung over the valley. He had arrived a decade prior with a fortune of mysterious origin and had systematically bought up land, water rights, and loyalty. He and Thad had once been associates, a friendship fueled by whiskey and ambition, but it had soured when Thad realized Kane's ambition had no limits and no conscience. A few days later, Kane paid a visit to the Broken Star. Evelyn saw him from the cabin as he rode toward the main house, a large, imposing figure on a powerful black horse. He did not glance in their direction. He was there to see the master of the ranch, not the outcast brother. Wes was out checking on the herd, so she watched alone, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. She learned what had passed later that evening, when one of the loyal ranch hands rode over on the pretense of delivering a sack of oats. He told Wes that Kane had sat with Thad on the main porch for nearly an hour. He had spoken of the drought, of the thinning herds, of the banknotes held by Vernon Pratt. And then he had made an offer, a laughably low price for the entire Broken Star ranch. The ranch hand shifted his feet. Looking at the ground, he said Kane told Thad it was a generous offer, considering, said a woman's debt can sink a man faster than any drought. Wes's face hardened, the scar on his cheekbone standing out white against his tanned skin. He thanked the man for the information and stood for a long time after he had gone, staring toward the main house, a silhouette against the dying light. The first real attack came a week later. They were woken in the dead of night by a strange, flickering orange light against their window. Wes was out of his cot in an instant. Evelyn followed him to the door. In the distance, toward the main ranch, a pillar of fire clawed at the black sky. "The main hayrick," Wes said, his voice grim. "The entire winter's feed." He saddled his horse in a desperate hurry, his movement sharp and angry. "Stay inside," he ordered her. "Lock the door." He rode off into the night, a lone figure charging toward the disaster. Evelyn stood at the window for hours, watching the terrible fire burn, a malevolent star that had fallen to earth. It was a mortal blow to a ranch already staggering under the weight of the drought. Wes returned just before dawn, his face smudged with soot, his body slumped with exhaustion and defeat. The rick was a total loss. By the time they had gotten a bucket brigade going, it was too late. He sank onto a stool by the cold hearth, the fight gone out of him. "It was set," he said, his voice flat. "I found the oil can tossed in the brush." The next day brought more bad news. Several head of their best cattle were found wandering on a neighbor's property, their Broken Star brand expertly altered to look like Kane's. The whispers in town, already cruel, grew fangs. Wes Mallory, people said, had married that fallen woman from Missouri just to get his hands on her child, to pass it off as his own heir. Now the ranch was cursed, falling apart under the weight of his sin. The fire, the altered brands, it was all a sign. The breaking point for Thad came 2 days after the fire. He rode up to their small cabin, his face a thundercloud of repressed fury. He dismounted but did not approach the door, standing by his horse as if their home were contaminated. "This has to stop! Weston!" he called out, his voice tight and strained. Wes came out of the cabin to face him, Evelyn watching from the doorway, her heart a cold stone in her chest.
What has to stop, Thad?
All of it. The whispers, the disasters, the bad luck you brought to our doorstep. He finally looked past Wes and glared at Evelyn. Ever since she arrived, this ranch has been bleeding. The drought worsened, the hay burns, the cattle are stolen. Vernon Pratt is talking about foreclosure. Cain is circling like a vulture. You have invited a curse into this family. That is foolish talk, Thad, and you know it, Wes said, his voice low and steady. Cain is behind the fire and the cattle. He is trying to break you. And you helped him, Thad shot back. You gave him the perfect weapon. You divided this house. You shamed our name. For her. The raw pain and resentment in his voice were terrible to hear. He was a man backed into a corner, lashing out at the nearest target. And the nearest target was them. I came here to tell you, Thad said, his voice dropping to a cold, formal tone. You are on your own. The hands have been warned not to help you. The supplies from the main house are cut off. You made your choice on that porch. Now you will live with it. He mounted his horse without another word and rode away, leaving a silence that felt heavier and more final than any argument. They were truly alone now, an island in a hostile sea. The sky began to change the next afternoon. The brilliant, pitiless blue faded to a sickly yellow gray. The air grew still and heavy, charged with an unnatural energy. Wes was miles away, checking a line of traps he had set for rabbits, their only reliable source of fresh meat. Evelyn had been tending to her small, struggling garden, her hands in the dry soil. When she noticed the eerie quiet, the birds had stopped singing. The insects were silent. She looked to the west and saw it. A dark, roiling wall of brown was rising from the horizon, blotting out the mountains, consuming the sky, a sandstorm. She had heard stories of them but had never seen one. She hurried toward the cabin, the wind beginning to pick up, whining through the cottonwood trees. It came faster than she could have imagined. One moment, she could see the barn. The next, the world was gone, erased by a solid, screaming wall of sand and wind. The force of it threw her against the cabin wall. The air was instantly thick, unbreathable. Grit filled her eyes, her nose, her mouth. She was blinded, disoriented. The roar of the wind, a physical pressure against her eardrums. She tried to find the door, her hands scrabbling against the rough timber. But the world was a howling, chaotic vortex. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She sank to the ground, curling into a ball, trying to shield her face with her arms. The tiny life inside her, her only thought. Wes had seen the storm coming from the ridge. He rode Ash hard, the horse's powerful legs eating up the ground. He had a deep, primal fear of these storms. But a greater fear drove him now Evelyn, alone at the cabin. By the time he reached the edge of their small clearing, the storm hit. Visibility dropped to zero. He could not see the cabin, could not see anything but the thick, brown chaos. He dismounted, shouting her name, the sound swallowed by the gale. He tied a kerchief over his nose and mouth and stumbled forward, leading Ash, one hand on the familiar leather of the saddle. He moved by instinct, counting his paces, praying he was heading in the right direction. He found the cabin wall by slamming into it. He shouted her name again, his voice raw. No answer. He began to circle the small building, one hand braced against the logs, his heart pounding with a terror he had not felt in years. It was the old nightmare, the feeling of being too late, of a life slipping away while he stood helpless. He would not let it happen again. He found her huddled on the far side of the cabin, a small, still shape against the foundation. He dropped to his knees, his hands finding her shoulders. She was trembling violently, but she was alive. Relief so powerful it almost buckled him, washed through him. He pulled her to her feet, shouting into her ear to be heard over the wind. "We have to get to the barn. It is safer there." He half carried, half dragged her through the blinding fury of the storm. Inside the small barn, the noise was muffled, but the wind hammered against the walls, threatening to tear the roof from its rafters. He settled her into a pile of clean straw in an empty stall, then saw to the horses, his movements sure and calming despite the chaos outside. When he came back to her, she was still shaking. He took off his heavy duster coat and wrapped it around her, pulling the collar up around her face. He sat beside her in the straw, his shoulder pressing against hers. He said nothing for a long time. Then he reached for the rein from Ash's bridle. He took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around her smaller, colder one. He looped the end of the leather rein around her wrist, then around his own, tying a simple, secure knot. "Just so you know I am here," he said, his voice a low rumble in the roaring dark. A physical link, a promise, in the heart of the storm. Tied together by a strip of worn leather, they waited for the world to reappear. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world remade. The air, scoured clean of dust, was crisp and cool. A thin, pale layer of sand covered everything, softening the harsh lines of the land and muffling all sound. Night fell, and in the profound silence, the stars seemed impossibly bright and close, scattered like diamond dust on black velvet. Inside the cabin, a small fire in the now cleared hearth pushed a warm, gentle light into the corners of the room. The scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee slowly replaced the stale, dusty smell of the storm. Wes had untied the leather rein from their wrists the moment the wind had died, but a phantom feeling of its touch lingered on Evelyn's skin. They sat in a quiet, born not of awkwardness, but of shared exhaustion and survival. The world had tried to tear them apart, and they had weathered it, together. Evelyn watched him as he stared into the flames, his face a landscape of light and shadow. The events of the past weeks played through her mind the fire that had consumed their winter hay, a symbol of their future going up in smoke, the cold, final words from his brother, and the terrifying, blind chaos of the storm. Through it all, he had been a constant, a shield. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet room, "for what you did today, in the storm. You saved me." He turned his head to look at her, his gray eyes serious in the firelight. Anyone would have done the same. "No," she insisted softly. "Not anyone, and not just today. On the porch, when I first arrived, you stood for me when you had every reason to turn your back. I have never understood why." He was quiet for a long time, his gaze returning to the fire. He picked up a small piece of kindling and began to turn it over and over in his strong hands. The firelight glinted off the faint scar on his cheekbone. "I knew a woman once," he began, his voice low and rough, as if the words were being pulled from a deep, seldom visited place. "Her name was Anna. I was young, full of myself. I thought freedom was the most important thing a man could have. Freedom from being tied down, from being responsible for anyone but myself." He paused, and Evelyn held her breath, knowing she was being given a piece of his soul. "She wanted to get married," he continued. "Settle down, I kept putting it off, made excuses. I told myself there was plenty of time. Then that winter, the fever came through. It moved fast. I was away, helping with a cattle drive, chasing that freedom I thought was so important. By the time I got the news and rode back, it was too late. I was standing over her grave." He looked up from the fire, his eyes meeting hers, and she saw in them a profound and ancient sorrow. "I learned something that day," he said. "I learned that turning your back on someone, telling yourself you will deal with it tomorrow, is the worst kind of cowardice. There is nothing in this world more important than standing for someone when they need you. Nothing. So when I saw you on that porch, looking so lost, and I saw my brother turning his back for the sake of his pride, I made a promise to myself, standing over that grave, that I would never do that again." I would never be too late again. The confession settled in the space between them, a truth that explained everything. It was not pity that had moved him. It was a fierce, private honor, forged in the crucible of loss. His quiet strength was not a gift of nature. It was a choice, remade every day. A penance for a past he could not change. The generosity of his admission opened a door in her own heart, a place she had kept locked and barred since arriving in Wyoming. His honesty deserved her own. "My husband," she began, her voice unsteady at first. "The man who died. He was a respected man in our town, a deacon at the church, to everyone on the outside. He was kind and good." She paused, gathering her courage. "But a house can be a prison, even with the doors unlocked. He never laid a hand on me. His weapons were his words, his silence. He could make me feel like a ghost in my own home, like my thoughts, my feelings. They did not matter. He chipped away at me, day by day, until I started to believe him, until I started to feel like I was nothing more than a part of his house, like a chair or a table, something to be used and kept in its proper place." Tears she had refused to shed for months began to trace silent paths through the dust on her cheeks. "When I found out about the child, I knew I could not stay. I could not bring a new life into a house with no air, no light. I had to leave, for the baby's sake, for a chance at something better. I did not lie in my letters because I'm a deceitful person. I lied because I chose to live, for me and for my child." She finished, her breath catching in a sob. She had never spoken these words aloud to anyone. Wes moved from his stool and knelt on the hearth in front of her chair. He did not touch her. He simply waited, his presence a solid comfort in the flickering light. When her tears subsided, she looked at him, her heart raw and open. "You do not owe me anything, Wes. You have already done more for me than I ever deserved. You paid your debt to the past. You can be free of it now, free of me." He shook his head slowly, a profound certainty in his eyes that silenced her. "No," he said, his voice soft but absolute. He reached out and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with the pad of his thumb. His touch was warm, real. "I choose you, Evelyn, not for Anna, not for my pride. For you, it is like choosing to breathe. I did not realize I needed to until I did." In his eyes, she saw not just honor, not just kindness, but a deep and quiet affection that mirrored the startling, unexpected feelings that had taken root in her own heart. In this small, smoke-scented cabin, surrounded by the ashes of their old lives, they had found each other. He stood and went to the small table where he kept his leather-working tools. He picked up a thin, supple strip of rein, the same kind he had used to tie them together in the storm. With deft, sure movements, his hands, which could calm a wild horse or mend a broken wheel, worked the leather. He wove it and knotted it into a small, intricate ring, a perfect, tiny braid. He knelt before her again and took her left hand. He slipped the small leather ring onto her finger, pushing it up against the plain gold band he had placed there in the church. The two rings sat together, one a symbol of a desperate bargain, the other a symbol of a bond freely chosen. "This one is different," he said. "This one is a promise, not of protection, but of partnership, not a debt, but a choice." The next morning, the world felt new. The air was clean, and the rising sun cast long, gentle shadows across the sand-swept land, feeling lighter than she had in years. Evelyn resolved to make a proper breakfast. She hummed a little tune as she worked, a melody from a life she thought she had forgotten. Distracted by her own newfound happiness, she let her attention wander. A plume of black smoke soon billowed from the cast-iron skillet. The bacon was burned to a crisp, and the biscuits in the oven were blackened lumps. Mortified, she was frantically waving a dish towel at the smoke when Wes came in from the barn. He stopped, took in the scene, and a slow grin spread across his face. Evelyn's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I am so sorry. I ruined it." Wes walked over to the stove, picked up one of the charred biscuits, and took a bite. He chewed for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he nodded with great seriousness. "A little crunchy on the outside," he declared, "but the flavor is bold, very bold. My compliments to the chef." He took another bite, and the sight of him gamely chewing the disastrous biscuit was so ridiculous, so kind, that a bubble of laughter rose up inside her. It burst out, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. He joined in, his own deep laughter filling the smoky kitchen. They stood there, laughing amid the ruins of breakfast, and the cabin finally, truly, felt like a home. Later that morning, feeling a sense of quiet courage, Evelyn walked out to the corral. Ash, the wild, dark horse, stood in the far corner, watching her with his usual wary intelligence. He had always been a mirror of her own fear. She walked to the fence and leaned against it, not approaching him directly. She began to speak, her voice soft and low, telling him about the sunrise, about the burned biscuits, about nothing at all. He watched her for a long time, his ears twitching, processing the new, calm energy that surrounded her. Then, slowly, he took a step toward her, and another. He walked all the way to the fence and stopped, his dark, liquid eyes looking directly into hers, trembling slightly. She reached a hand through the rails. For the first time, he did not flinch. He did not pull away. He lowered his great head and allowed her to rest her palm against his forehead. His skin was warm and alive beneath her touch. A silent truce, a beginning of trust. A single, sharp crack echoed from the direction of the main ranch, shattering the morning's peace. It was the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. Ash threw his head up, startled, and bolted to the far side of the corral. Evelyn's hand fell back to her side, her heart suddenly cold with a new and nameless dread. The peace was over. The outside world, with all its dangers, was coming for them. The gunshot was flat and ugly in the clean morning air. Wes was moving before the echo faded, saddling Ash with an economy of motion that spoke of pure, cold dread. He gave Evelyn a look, a command to stay safe, a promise to return, and was gone. A dark streak against the pale land, riding hard for the main ranch. He found his brother on the porch, a rifle held loosely in his hands. Down by the dry creek bed, a water wagon, its barrels freshly filled from a deep well near the main house, was blocked by 3 riders. One of them was Luther Kane's foreman, a man with a brutish face and a pistol holstered high on his hip. Thad had fired a warning shot into the air. "This is my water, from my well, on my land." Thad's voice was a low, angry growl that carried across the yard. Kane's man spat into the dust. "Mister, Kane says all water in this valley is under his protection now. To ensure fair distribution, this wagon is not going to that squatter's cabin you let your brother build." Wes reined Ash in beside the porch. "What is this, Thad?" Thad didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on the men by the creek. "Kane is making his move." "Let me ride down there with you." "I do not need your help," Thad said, the words stiff with pride. "This is my fight." He raised the rifle slightly. "Now get off my property, all of you." The foreman laughed, a short, ugly sound. He and his men turned their horses and trotted away. Their message delivered. The wagon remained where it was, a symbol of their new siege. Wes looked at his brother, at the rigid line of his back, and saw a man drowning in his own stubbornness. There was nothing he could say. He turned Ash and rode back to the cabin, the frustration a bitter taste in his mouth. The trap tightened 2 days later. The elderly minister from town rode out, his face etched with worry. He carried a letter for Thad, but he delivered its news to Wes first. Vernon Pratt, citing a long list of unpaid property taxes and backed by a new survey commissioned by Luther Kane, had officially filed foreclosure papers on the Broken Star. "It is fraud," Wes said, his hands clenching into fists. "We have paid our taxes." The minister shook his head sadly. The records at the courthouse say otherwise. Son, Pratt has produced ledgers showing years of discrepancies. The circuit judge is due in a month. If Thad cannot produce proof to the contrary, the bank will take everything. They were being erased, their history rewritten in a ledger book by a man with a fat cigar and a soul full of ink. That night, the cabin was silent and suffocating. Wes stared into the fire, defeated. Evelyn watched him, her heart aching for the weight he carried. She refused to believe they were beaten. There had to be another way, a truth the land knew, even if men had forgotten it. The next morning, driven by a restless energy, she began a thorough cleaning of the cabin, a simple, physical act to combat the helplessness she felt. In a dusty corner of the loft, tucked under a loose floorboard, she found a small, leather-bound journal. It was the diary of the trapper who had built the cabin decades ago. His entries were short, practical notes on weather and game, but tucked into a flap in the back cover was a folded, brittle piece of oilcloth. She carefully unfolded it. It was a map, drawn by a steady, patient hand. It showed the valley, the main creek, and the location of the cabin. But it also showed something else. High in the hills behind their cabin, the trapper had drawn a small circle and labeled it Sweetwater Spring. Never runs dry. And from that circle, a thin, faint line snaked down the contours of the hills, bypassing Kane's property entirely, and ending near their small pasture. It was a potential route for a new ditch, a secret artery of life hidden in the land itself. Hope, fierce and sharp, surged through her. It was a desperate chance, a monumental task. Digging a ditch that long would take a dozen men weeks. They had no men and no time, but they were not the only ones suffering. Leaving West to his grim thoughts, she saddled the old mare and rode for Bitter Willow. She did not go to the saloon. She went to the general store, where she knew the women of the valley gathered. Martha, the owner's wife who had once eyed her with suspicion, now looked at her with a weary sympathy born of shared hardship. The minister's wife was there, as were the wives of two other small ranchers whose lands were also slowly turning to dust. Evelyn unrolled the oilcloth map on the main counter. "There is water," she said, her voice clear and strong. "High in the hills. Enough for all of us if we can bring it down. Wes and I cannot do it alone, but together." She looked from face to face, seeing the flicker of doubt, the spark of desperate interest. She had no money to offer them. "I cannot pay you in coin," she said, "but I can pay you in promises. Help us dig, help us save the broken star, and my own small herd, and when the water flows, you will have a share of our milk, our cheese, the blankets I can weave this winter. This is not charity. It is a partnership." The women were silent for a long moment. Then Martha, the storekeeper's wife, looked at the others and nodded slowly. "My well is nearly dry," she said. "My husband is talking about moving on. I would rather hold a shovel than pack a wagon. I am in one by one." The others agreed. An alliance was forged, not with contracts and handshakes, but with shared looks of grim determination over a faded trapper's map. The work began at dawn the next day. A small army of 7 women, Evelyn and Wes, armed with picks, shovels, and a stubborn refusal to be broken. The ground was hard, baked solid by the relentless sun. The work was brutal, back-breaking, but they worked with a silent, furious energy. The rhythmic scrape and thud of their tools the only sound in the vast quiet. They were not alone for long. By mid-morning, 3 riders appeared on the ridge above them. Kane's foreman and 2 of his hired thugs. One of them, a young man with haunted eyes named Pete. They rode down the slope and blocked the path. "This is private property," the foreman snarled. "And that is Kane's water. Drop the tools and go home." Wes stepped in front of the women, placing himself between them and the riders. He was unarmed. His hands were open at his sides. "You are trespassing," Wes said, his voice level. "This is Broken Star Land, and the water in those hills belongs to whoever is willing to work for it." The foreman laughed. Work. This land belongs to the man strong enough to take it. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the still air. At that exact moment, a high, piercing whistle cut through the tension. It came from the minister, who stood on a nearby rise. It was their signal. In town, doors opened. Men who had been shamed by their wives' courage began to move. On the road, the familiar, plodding shape of Sheriff Morris's horse appeared, kicking up a slow cloud of dust. The sheriff was an old man, his back bent by years in the saddle, but his eyes were sharp. He rode up to the tense standoff, his gaze taking in the armed rider, Wes standing his ground, and the line of determined women with their shovels held like spears. "What is the trouble here?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Just clearing off some trespassers." "Sheriff," the foreman said, not lowering his gun. Sheriff Morris looked at the pistol, then at the man holding it. "The law moves slow in this territory," he said, "but it is still the law, and the law says you do not draw a weapon on unarmed women. Holster it, now." Reluctantly, the foreman slid the pistol back into its holster. Evelyn, her heart pounding, stepped forward. She planted the tip of her shovel in the hard earth. "Well," she said, a small, defiant smile on her face, "while we wait for the law, let us bring the water home." The foreman opened his mouth to object, but another voice cut him off. "She is right. The young rider," Pete said suddenly. His face was pale, his hands trembling. "He is lying, Sheriff, all of it." He pulled a small, black ledger from his saddlebag and urged his horse forward, holding the book out to the sheriff. "Kane and Pratt, they have been stealing for years, altering tax records, embezzling funds. It is all in here. They ruined my family. My sister," his voice broke. "This is for her." Just as the sheriff took the book, another rider galloped up. It was Thad. He had seen the gathering from the main house, his pride warring with his fear. He saw the armed men. He saw the sheriff. And he saw Evelyn, a pregnant woman with a shovel in her hand, leading an army of wives against an injustice he had been too proud to fight himself. He saw his brother, willing to die for a principle. And in that moment, the dam of his pride finally broke. He rode straight to Wes's side, turning his horse to face Kane's men. "I was wrong, brother," he said, his voice rough with an emotion no one had ever heard from him before. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes filled with a new, grudging respect. "I am sorry for everything. I stand with my family." With the ledger in his hand and Thad's public declaration, the tide had turned. The sheriff's face was grim. He looked at the foreman. "Where is Luther Kane?" The man jerked his head toward the distant, jagged line of the canyons. "He saw you coming. Sheriff, he rode for the high country." The sheriff nodded. He disarmed the stunned foreman and his remaining man. "You two are under arrest." He looked at Pete. "You did the right thing, son. Now ride to town with my deputy and tell him to arrest Vernon Pratt. Show him this book." The immediate battle was over. Pratt and his thugs were finished. Kane was a fugitive, and before them lay the hard, promising earth, waiting for their shovels. The law of the stream was about to be rewritten. There was no time for deliberation. As his deputy led the captured men away, and Pete rode for town with the damning ledger, Sheriff Morris looked at the darkening sky, then at the distant slash of Wolf Canyon. He is running for the rough country. He will be impossible to track if he gets a good lead. He looked at Wes, then at Thad, who sat on his horse with a newfound, humbled resolve. "I am deputizing you both. Let us ride." The chase was a brutal, lung-searing pursuit across the parched land. The three men rode hard, their horses' hooves throwing up plumes of red dust that hung in the still, heavy air. Luther Kane was a skilled horseman, pushing his powerful black charger through the landscape with a desperate, reckless speed. He had a considerable head start, and he knew the labyrinth of canyons and gullies that scarred the high country like an old wound. As they rode, the world began to change. The oppressive, brassy glare of the sun softened, hidden behind a high, thin veil of gray cloud. The wind, for so long a hot, dry breath, died completely. An expectant silence fell over the land, a silence so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. Then, a single, fat drop of rain struck the back of Wes's hand. Another hit the dust at his feet, leaving a dark, star-shaped mark. Within minutes, a steady drizzle had begun, the scent of rain on thirsty earth. A smell they had all but forgotten rose around them, thick and sweet. It was the smell of life, of hope. But as they entered the narrow mouth of Wolf Canyon, the blessing began to reveal its other face. The drizzle became a downpour, a solid, silver sheet of water that slicked the rocks and turned the dusty canyon floor into a greasy, treacherous mud. The land, baked hard by months of drought, could not drink the sudden deluge. The water began to run, gathering in rivulets that snaked down the canyon walls, merging into a gurgling, brown stream that quickly began to rise around their horses' legs. The chase had become a race not just against a man, but against the very water they had prayed for. Cain was deeper in the canyon, a fleeting shadow in the gray, lashing rain. He knew this place. He abandoned his horse, which was struggling in the rising torrent, and began to scramble up the slick, rocky side of the canyon wall, finding handholds and footholds that were nearly invisible. He moved with the agility of a cornered animal, disappearing into a tangle of rock and stunted juniper 100 feet above the canyon floor. Wes, Thad, and the sheriff were forced to dismount as well, the water now a churning, powerful current sucking at their boots. "He has gone to ground," the sheriff shouted over the roar of the water and the drumming of the rain. "He will wait for us to pass and pick us off." "I will go up," Wes said. "I can climb. You two stay with the horses. Draw his fire if you can." "No," Thad said, his voice firm. "I am going with you. This is my fault. I let him get this strong. I will help you finish it." Before Wes could argue, Thad was already moving, following his brother's path up the treacherous rock face. The rain hammered them, blurring their vision, making every surface a slippery peril. Below them, the stream had become a raging river, a muddy, churning force that filled the canyon from wall to wall. They climbed in a tense, focused silence, the only sounds the scrape of their boots on rock and the roar of the storm. They were halfway up the cliff when Wes saw it, a flicker of movement on a ledge above and to their left. It was Cain, braced against the rock, his rifle raised. He was not aiming at Thad. He was aiming directly at Wes. "Wes, look out!" Thad yelled, the words torn away by the wind. There was no time to think, only to act, in a single, fluid motion born of a lifetime of regret and a final, desperate surge of brotherly love. Thad lunged. He shoved Wes with all his strength, pushing him sideways, flat against the rock face. The rifle cracked, the sound sharp and vicious even in the storm. Wes felt a searing, tearing pain as a splinter of rock, dislodged by the bullet, grazed his cheek. He saw his brother jerk, a strange, surprised look on his face. Thad grunted, a sound of profound shock, and then his grip on the rock failed. He slid, tumbling backward off the narrow ledge and into the churning, brown water below. A raw, primal rage, hotter than any fire, exploded in Wes's chest. He did not hesitate. He scrambled up the remaining distance to Cain's ledge, his fingers finding holds with a strength he did not know he possessed. He pulled himself over the top just as Cain was fumbling to reload his rifle. Cain swung the rifle like a club, but Wes was inside its arc. He slammed his body into Cain's, and the two men crashed onto the narrow, slick stone, a tangle of desperate limbs. It was a brutal, primitive fight, driven by hate and fury. They rolled, grappling in the mud and rain, inches from the precipice. Wes's fist connected with Cain's jaw, a solid, crunching impact. Cain grunted and tried to push him away, to get leverage. Wes gained the upper hand, pinning Cain beneath him, his hands on the man's throat. Kane's eyes bulged with terror and rage. Below, he could see Sheriff Morris pulling Thad's limp body from the river, dragging him to a small spit of land. "Finish it!" Kane gasped, a bloody, triumphant sneer on his face. "Prove you are no better than me. This country belongs to the strong." Wes looked down at the man who had tried to destroy his family, who had just shot his brother. The rage inside him screamed for vengeance, for a final, violent justice. His fingers tightened, but then he saw Thad's face in his mind, the look of sacrifice, the selfless act that had saved his life. He saw Evelyn, her hand on her belly, her quiet strength. He saw the women of the valley, digging in the hard earth for a shared future. He saw a community choosing to build, not to destroy. "No," Wes said, his voice a low, ragged rasp. He loosened his grip. "It belongs to those who stand." He did not kill him. He took the rope from his belt and, with a grim and final efficiency, bound Luther Kane's hands behind his back, leaving him for the law to claim. The journey back was a slow, agonizing procession. The rain had softened to a steady, life-giving drizzle. Thad was alive, but barely. The bullet had torn through his shoulder, and he had lost a great deal of blood. Wes and the sheriff had fashioned a crude travois to carry him. A bound and sullen Luther Kane was tied to his own horse, a prisoner of the justice he had so long disdained. Evelyn saw them coming from the cabin window. She saw the slow, limping pace of the horses. She saw the makeshift travois, and her world tilted. A sharp, piercing cramp seized her belly, so intense it stole her breath and sent her staggering back against the table. The minister's wife, who had stayed with her, rushed to her side, her face a mask of concern. By the time Wes reached the main house with his brother, the news had spread. The town doctor was already on his way. He arrived in a flurry of purposeful action, his black bag a beacon of hope. He tended to Thad first, cleaning and binding the wound with a practiced skill. "It is bad," the doctor said, looking at Wes, "but the bullet went clean through. He is strong. He will live." Then he went to the small cabin, where Evelyn lay pale and frightened on her cot. Wes waited on the small porch, his heart a cold knot of fear. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, the doctor emerged, his face tired but calm. "The young lady gave us all a fright," he said, wiping his hands on a cloth. "It is not her time yet. The shock and the fear brought on some false pains. She is exhausted, and she must rest. Complete rest, you understand me. But she is strong, too. Your wife and your child are going to be fine." Relief, so profound it left him weak-kneed, washed over Wes. As the doctor rode back to town, a new sound began to drift up from the main ranch. It was the rhythmic sound of hammers. Looking down, Wes saw a half-dozen men, ranchers and townsfolk, working by lantern light. They had wagons of fresh-cut timber and bundles of hay. Unasked, the community had come. They were rebuilding the burned hayrick, raising a new structure from the ashes, a monument to their shared victory against the darkness that had almost consumed them all. The rain that had come as a cleansing fury gentled into a soft, steady gift that soaked deep into the grateful earth. It rained for 3 days, a quiet, persistent drumming on the roof of the cabin, washing the world clean. When the sun finally returned, it rose on a landscape transformed. The pale, dusty brown had given way to 1,000 shades of hopeful green. And down from the hills, gurgling in the ditch dug by the hands of women, came the clear, cold water of Sweetwater Spring. The ditch flowed past the main house, through the parched pastures, and filled the livestock troughs. It was a silver ribbon of life, stitching the fractured community back together. The cattle, thin and weary from the drought, drank deeply, and a new energy seemed to flow into them. In Evelyn's small garden, the thirsty plants perked up, and a row of pumpkins began to swell, their cheerful orange a bright promise against the dark, damp soil. Thad recovered slowly, For weeks, he was confined to his bed in the main house, his arm in a sling, his body and spirit mending at the same pace. Wes and Evelyn moved into the main house to care for him, the small trapper's cabin left to the quiet hum of the returning insects. The old tensions were gone, replaced by a quiet, unspoken understanding. The brothers would sit on the porch in the long, cool evenings, not saying much, but the silence was comfortable. The chasm between them bridged by a shared ordeal and a single, selfless act on a rain-slicked cliff. One afternoon, as Evelyn brought Thad a bowl of broth, he stopped her before she could leave the room. He was sitting in a chair by the window, looking out at the new, green world. He had a humbled, quieter air about him now, the hard edges of his pride worn smooth by his brush with death. "Evelyn," he said, his voice still weak but clear. He did not call her Mrs. Mallory. He used her name. I never apologized, not properly, for that first day on the porch. "You do not have to," she said softly. "Yes, I do," he insisted, turning to look at her. His eyes, once so cold, were filled with a weary respect. "I saw only what I wanted to see, a problem, a threat to my name. I did not see you. I saw how strong you were that day, with the shovel in your hands, facing down Cain's men. Stronger than I was. I was wrong. I hope, in time, you can forgive me." "There is nothing to forgive." "Thad," she said, and she meant it. "We are family." A few weeks later, as the first chill of winter began to creep into the night air, Evelyn's time came. It was a quick and blessedly easy birth, as if the child itself were eager to join this new, hopeful world. She was a girl, with a fuzz of dark hair and eyes that, when they opened, were the same steady, storm gray as her father's. They named her Hope. The arrival of the baby sealed the final piece in the Mallory house. Thad, his arm now out of the sling, would stand over her crib for long stretches, a look of quiet wonder on his face. He was an uncle, a role he took to with a surprising and touching seriousness. The community that had once shunned Evelyn now embraced her. The women of the valley, their alliance forged in the hard earth of the ditch, became her fast friends. Martha from the general store proposed that Evelyn start a sewing circle to teach the younger women and girls a valuable skill. Evelyn agreed, with one condition: that the class be open to everyone, including the daughters of the poorest ranch hands, who often had no prospects beyond a life of hard labor. The sewing circle became a place of laughter and learning, a quiet engine of change in the heart of Bitter Willow. Life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. Luther Kane and Vernon Pratt had been sentenced to long prison terms by the circuit judge, their reign of greed and fear broken for good. The ledger Pete had provided had not only saved the Broken Star, but had also returned stolen funds to several other small ranchers, restoring a sense of justice and balance to the valley. One evening, Evelyn sat in a rocking chair by the fire, nursing Hope, a feeling of profound contentment settling over her. Wes came and sat on the floor beside her, leaning his back against the chair. He had just come in from the barn and smelled of hay and cold, clean air. He reached out and stroked the baby's soft cheek with one calloused finger. "She is so small," he said in a low, awestruck voice. "I can handle a 1,000-pound bull easier than I can handle this." He had tried changing her swaddling earlier in the day, an exercise in fumbling frustration that had left both him and the baby wailing. Evelyn laughed softly. "You are good with cattle, but you are no match for a baby's diaper," she teased. He smiled, leaning his head back against her knee. "Guess I will just have to keep practicing." He fell silent, watching the firelight dance on the baby's face. The house was quiet, filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the warmth of a home, of a family not just made, but chosen and fought for. Later, after the baby was asleep in her crib, they stood on the porch, looking out at the land. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in strokes of deep rose and violet. A new gate, built by Wes and Thad together, stood at the end of the long drive. Wes reached over and closed it, the latch clicking shut with a sound of quiet finality. He came back to the porch and stood behind Evelyn, placing his hands on her shoulders, his chin resting lightly on the top of her head. They stood like that for a long time, watching the stars begin to appear in the deepening twilight. The air was cold and crisp. The new ditch gurgled softly in the distance, a sound of constant, quiet life. "Thank you," Evelyn whispered, looking from the sleeping house to the dark, life-giving line of the stream, "for choosing to stay." Wes smiled, a slow, sure smile she could feel more than see. He tightened his hold on her shoulders, pulling her back against his chest. "I did not just stay. Evelyn," he said, his voice a low, warm murmur against her hair. "I belong here, with you." Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from in the world to connect with others. Subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.